Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video I want to talk about Brexit again, and there is a lot going on with Brexit. There is a lot of commentary, there's a lot of analysis and so on, and many people have, a lot of it's really good as well. So a lot of people are focusing on the economic failures of Brexit. They're focusing on the political failures of Brexit. They're focusing on the distorted consequences and all the other things, and some of the drivers as well behind Brexit, whether that was people wanting better democracy, whether that was driven in a large part by racism, intolerance, selfish desires, and so on. So a lot of that is valid, a lot of that is worth examining. But I've seen very little commentary about Brexit in the context of corruption. And I think that is because this is a very uncomfortable subject for many people. It's not something that they can feel happy about talking. But I think it's important. I think it is missing in the whole debate about Brexit, this whole topic of corruption. It's a big elephant in the room that no one seems to want to talk about. And I'm not afraid to have that conversation. I'm very happy to go out there and explain my views and my thinking, and to why I think this is so relevant to the Brexit project, and why it has led to the failures of Brexit that we see today. Because, and this will be part of the conclusion, you cannot divorce the consequences, the realities of Brexit with the corruption that underpinned its development. So this particular video will be not so much talking about negotiation, but more on the political side of things. So I hope you find it interesting and helpful. Please do like and subscribe to this channel if you like this sort of content. And let's dive straight in. Now, before I talk about Brexit itself, let's talk more broadly about what corruption is, because I'm sure some people have a bit of an oversimple view of it, and it's important to highlight some of the more nuanced aspects of corruption. Whenever anyone says corruption, people think of money. They think of money in brown envelopes. They think of underhand deals. They think of positions and so on and so forth. And that's all true. That is all the sort of the visible consequences of corruption, in that people are given money for doing things that they really should not be doing. But the thing you have to understand about corruption is that it goes so much deeper than just being about money. What corruption is a process by which people have to justify, and everyone has an element, a little part of the brain that says, I want to justify what I'm doing. No one likes to think about themselves as being a bad or corrupt person. So whenever anyone goes down the path of engaging in corrupt practices, accepting money, the brain finds a need to justify it. And you can see this, so often whenever you look at someone who's been convicted of corruption or been found guilty or whatever, they always seem to think, oh, it wasn't that bad, or I wasn't doing it, or I was doing the right thing, and so on. So one of the important things to think about corruption is that it is not an overnight thing. It is like radicalization. You don't just get up one morning, become immediately radicalized, and immediately go and commit terrorist acts. There's a whole series of steps that people have to go through before they reach that point where the brain justifies, carrying out such terrible acts of violence. And so a similar process has to happen for corruption. There has to be a series of steps by which people stop being hugely uncomfortable with it. The brain starts to accept it, and then they start to justify what they are doing or their involvement in that corruption as being necessary or beneficial. And the brain does strange things. The brain distorts their view of the world as a consequence of that. And there are very many examples of this. So we have to understand that when that happens, corruption itself becomes a way of thinking. It almost becomes an ideology. So I'm going to accept this money because I can use this money to do good, sort of thinking. never mind the fact that dirty money to start with. So that is often the rabbit hole that a lot of people go down when they're part of a corrupt organisation. They find they cannot fight it, so they might as well join it. So corruption, it's important to recognise this about corruption, because it's not just about the money. It can distort an entire organisation, an entire country, and it thus becomes normalised. And when corruption becomes normalised, or impossible to resist, shall we say, perhaps is a better way of phrasing it, then it spreads. It spreads like a terrible virus sort of thing. It infects an entire organisation. It affects the way people are thinking. It affects the structures of any particular organisation. So even if you only start, for example, with the chief executive, or just one layer below that being the corrupt individuals, then in not too short a space of time, that acceptance of that corruption then becomes normalised, and before you know it, even the most junior people of that particular organisation will then be accepting handouts or corruption or the status quo, simply because it has now been normalised. So this is the important thing we need to understand when thinking about corruption in the context of Brexit. It goes far beyond money, and it goes well into the realms of how people think and how things become normalised that in the past would not have ever have been normalised or accepted. And that is one of the really big things whenever you look at politics today, not just in the UK, but in the US and in Europe as well. There's a whole host of things that would not have been normalised, 10 or even 5 years ago. And it goes beyond money. Now, to make this video work and to not become a huge, massive topic, I'm going to narrow this. And I'm going to narrow this by making some very controversial assumptions. And that assumption is going to be very much that I'm going to be talking about corruption and Brexit pretty much in the context of the Conservative Party. So the key assumption here is that the Conservative Party is the most corrupt political party in the UK. Possibly within Europe, I don't know. But my assumption here is going to be they are the most corrupt political party in the UK. I don't have evidence to substantiate this. This is more my personal opinion. But there is plenty of analysis, plenty of other people who will evidence this and will probably be able to substantiate this statement. But the reason why I'm making this statement is because Brexit has also become associated with the Conservative Party. Because what we have to remember is, yes, there are lots of other groups who supported Brexit. They could be in Labour. They could be in what's now Reform UK and used to be UKIP. They could be normal people. And that, and they are not the Conservative Party. That is true. And there's also plenty of other organisations, political or otherwise, that are also corrupt, that are not the Conservative Party. That is also true. But the reason why I'm focusing on this being the Conservative Party, their corruption and their Brexit, is because they are the party in government. They are the ones in charge. So Brexit has only happened because they have implemented it. And so when we want to understand the influence that corruption has had on Brexit, we also need to understand the influence that corruption has had on the Conservative Party. And this is not a new problem. The Conservative Party have been battling corruption for a long time. Even David Cameron, the previous Prime Minister himself, hinted very much at this. And for anyone who reads magazines such as The Private Eye, will be very aware of the sheer scale of corruption. Having said all of that, I think despite the past legacy problems the Conservative Party has had with corruption, in recent years it has gone off the scale. And where I have seen evidence of that is when you hear on the radio, for example, old Conservative Party members. So Michael Heseltine, John Major, people like that, William Hague, people like that are true Conservative Party. No one's ever going to say they're not. Yet you can hear the disgust in their voice when they talk about the modern Conservative Party. So it's important to understand that I'm talking here about the modern Conservative Party itself, mainly the MPs, mainly those in charge. I am not talking about Conservative Party voters, and I'm not talking about Conservative Party members. This is pretty much about the parliamentary party and all the leadership and administration hierarchy that surround that. And that is critical for understanding the construct of Brexit and the influence that their problems has had on Brexit itself. So let's start this by talking about selfish interest, because selfish interest is usually at the heart of any corruption, not always, but usually. And we'll start with the obvious stuff first. So in the Conservative Party, they have a significant number of very high wealth individuals who make donations to the Conservative Party. Of course, it should be seen as purely coincidental that those individuals and those organisations that make such significant donations to the Conservative parties would of course benefit from any policies that may be enacted by the Conservative Party whilst in government. So it's purely coincidental, of course, that private healthcare companies donate to the Conservative Party and get private healthcare contract, or that education providers make large donations and penetrate UK education systems or have a permissive environment, and so on and so forth. All coincidental, of course. But what you have to understand, and what no one with any ounce of sense will overlook, is that these donors are not doing this for altruistic reasons. They're making donations because they want something. They want influence, usually. Soft influence, rather than necessarily direct linkage or hard influence. But influence nonetheless. And the problem for the Conservative Party is that it has become so dependent upon that money and that support that the modern Conservative Party is willing to take those interests of its party donors and put them above that, even of the interest of its own party members. That is how bad things are when it comes to looking at the whole scale of the donation to the Conservative Party problem. So I'm not going to go into that in too much more detail. But in the context of Brexit, we know that the donors will have wanted to influence the construct of Brexit. And of course, many of those donors are extremely wealthy, and many of them would rather not lose that wealth, for example, to government taxation. So again, it would seem purely coincidental that when Rishi Sunak announces the budget and he announces changes, let's take dividends and capital gains tax as a prime example. For ordinary people, with reasonable, but ordinary levels of wealth, they will start to pay more tax as a result of what Hunt announced as the changes to the threshold to capital gains tax and dividends tax. But if you're an ultra-high wealthy individual whose income is mainly sustained, who mainly incurs capital gains tax and dividends tax, well, changing the threshold by a few thousand actually makes no difference whatsoever to the levels of tax that they actually pay. If you're paying tax on millions worth of income, then paying a little bit more tax on £1,000 worth of it really doesn't affect anything. So if the Conservative Party really wanted to generate more income from those individuals, rather than changing the threshold, they would have changed the rate. So the dividend tax rate, for example, or capital gains tax rate. Or they could even have put different thresholds. So, for example, those above a certain high wealth would pay a certain higher rate. That is how the system is already structured, based on those who pay the basic or higher tax rate. So despite the economic problems that the country currently faces, it's little examples like that where you can see The Conservative Party will always favour its donors to the exclusion of everything else, and it would be naive to believe that Brexit was any different. There was even talk of making the UK the Singapore of Europe, and it was quite noticeable that the European Commission immediately enacted a raft of legislation and policy changes to make that as difficult as possible. So reading between the lines there, the EU Commission themselves consider the Conservative Party to be bent as anything, and recognising that they wanted to make the UK as a tax haven, they took steps to protect the European single market from those aspirations. So that is a little bit of self-interest that has driven a lot of what has happened in Brexit, not only what the UK government has done, but also how the European Commission has reacted to what the UK government has done or seeks to do. But it'd be wrong just to focus on party donors. I think it's also worth talking about business people who perhaps aren't themselves fully affiliated with the Conservative Party, but who themselves supported the Brexit project, whether through financial or other supportive means. And that is because they themselves did so because of self-interest. These individuals or organisations saw Brexit as an opportunity for deregulation. And this is a very complicated, broad topic, so I'm only going to touch upon it pretty superficially. But they are part of this process of corruption, because what they were seeking was benefit to them as individuals or as organisations. They wanted the workforce to have less protection, minimum wage legislation perhaps to be curtailed, environmental legislation, particularly if you're a water company, to not be too strictly enforced, perhaps, shall we say. So for them, they would have supported what the Conservative Party was doing and the aims of Brexit because it suited their financial or their particular organisational aims. And whilst that might not be money changing hands, it is still corruption of a sort. It is still putting your interest above that of what you know to be right. And when you're in that sort of territory, then you're in danger of entering into that sort of that little corrupt world. So this is one of the issues that we also have to recognise, that one of the big aspirations for Brexit is deregulation. And whilst many politicians might talk about deregulation as being economically beneficial for the UK, the absolute reality is the opposite is true. Deregulation is massively harmful for the UK. But it is beneficial, by coincidence, I must stress, to those who have donated to the Conservative Party and those in business who would like to cut their cost or cut the regulation that they need to comply with, regardless of the harm that it might cause to wider areas or to worker rights and so on. And it's counterproductive, really, to be honest, because deregulation just means that the UK cannot export to the European Union or even other markets because they will not accept lower standards. No competent market does. So this is a very much corrupt political rhetoric that serves narrow interests. It doesn't serve the wider interests of the UK as a whole. And people have to recognise that when the Conservative Party and politicians are talking about deregulation and bonfire of the EU regulations, that is what they mean. They mean about self-interest. This is not beneficial for the UK. This is, of course, not delving at all into the argument of bad regulation being bad, because bad regulation is bad, but that is not what this is about. This is purely about corrupt thinking justifying this particular policy. So really, I then must turn to the role of the media, because the whole point is the media are meant to point out these things. They're meant to point out all these corrupt practices, these linkages, these failures of policy, failures of thinking. Yet there seems to be so little of that from the mainstream media. And of course, I'm not talking about the smaller media outlets who are more independent. They themselves are doing a far better job. Even if we might disagree with them politically, they at least have the desire to try and understand the situation, to try and point out all the contradictions. But this is the problem, is that the mainstream media in the UK is very much embedded within the Westminster system. They have access, they have influence and privileges and so on. And if they rock the boat, that influence, that privilege will be removed. So what that means is that they now are complicit in all this corruption because they're not reporting on it. They're not criticising. They're not holding power to account as they should be, because to do so threatens their privileged access. And again, this is another thing that is worth stressing about corruption. It's not about the money. You can entice people in, you can radicalize them, you can have them, fitting into your little worldview purely because they feel part of the club. And that is very much part of the problem for the media. They are part of that club and they do not want to rock the boat, because to do so harms their own selfish interests and the interests of their owners. So what this kind of all mean, when you put it all together, is that we've ended up with a scenario where there's a huge distortion between what are the needs of the state and what are the needs of political parties stroke individuals. In the past, and maybe I'm taking a bit of a rose-tinted view here, but decent and honourable politicians would talk about putting country first, and party, their constituents second, and party third. I think Winston Churchill may have famously have said that, but I could be wrong there. And that was a part of recognition that power corrupts, and that they must, whatever they may consider to be their selfish interest, they must try and understand what is in the interest of the wider constituency, aka the UK people, the UK economy. And I think there's one way you can really sum up corruption in UK politics these days, and there's many things that can be said. But the fact that the Conservative Party itself has become part of the state and considers its interest to be aligned to that of the state. There's only one other country really that I'm aware of that does this to this extent, and that is Russia. And that is, the needs of Putin and his oligarchs are inseparable from the needs of the state because of how corrupt that system is. So when you compare the UK's thinking in comparison to Russia, you'll find there's some rather disturbing similarities and parallels. And I also, like Russia, what that means is that the UK political system does not welcome challenge. And anyone who a regular follower of this channel will know, and I talk about it often as part of, when I teach people how to conduct a negotiation, to be good at anything, including negotiation, including any particularly difficult or complex specialism, you need to have a culture of welcoming challenge. That is how you improve. That is how you get better as an individual. And any democratic political system needs to have a similar or very same culture, because when they cease to have that, then they cease to improve. That is the whole strength of democracy. Democracy is a constructive means by which people can challenge the status quo. And yet here we are in a situation of Brexit, where the wider population, and by recent polls I'm talking at least 60%, considers Brexit to be a dismal failure. Yet where is that challenge in political discourse? Where are the media, where are the politics adequately challenging the government, and specifically the Conservative Party, to say, what are you going to do to properly redress these failures? You have screwed up. When are you going to acknowledge that and do something about it? And at this point in time, the whole system is geared toward not allowing that challenge to be properly articulated. So it's a very strange disconnect with what the polls are saying and the way the political parties are working. I have to bring in the Labour Party here as well, because again, the Labour Party should be also articulating this challenge. They should be, as their role as opposition, saying Brexit is a massive failure. It needs to be changed in a pretty significant way. Whether that's to make it work, whether that's to reverse it, that's a different political conversation. But here we can see that they are certainly, even the Labour Party, not immune from corruption, not immune from the culture, the environment that they're having to operate within. And as a consequence of that, they themselves are too scared to properly challenge the Conservative Party, because if they do that, then the Westminster system, including the mainstream media, will turn against them and harm their ability to win the next election and form the next government. And that itself is very damning of the corruption that is infecting the Westminster system and surrounds the whole Brexit project. Now, there's a famous old saying that for evil to triumph, good people need only do nothing. And in the context of corruption, that is very much true. So for corruption to flourish, it needs a permissive environment. Any bad culture, whether you're talking about bullying or racism or whatever, for any of that to flourish, it needs a permissive culture. So here I want to talk about what permissive culture has done to allow Brexit and the corrupt Conservative Party to flourish in a way, to go to the extent of causing the significant levels of harm that it has done to the UK politics and to the UK economy. So, by the way, when I say corrupt Conservative Party, this is not a partisan attack. This is again based upon my assumptions, as I said earlier, that the Conservative Party is the most corrupt political party in the UK. And they've been allowed to conduct that because they've been permitted to conduct that. And so this goes back to my earlier point that corruption in many ways has been normalised. So the Conservative Party internally will have justified what they do. They will justify taking the money because they believe that they will try and turn that into they're trying to do good. So let's use the Truss and Kwarteng mini budget disaster as an example of that. They're taking money from oil, they're taking money from the donors, and they are turning their economic policies and justifying it with discredited trickle-down economics theory, for example, because that is a far easier way for their brain to process them taking that money and allowing and saying and arguing that they're doing so for the benefit of the country. But the problem is that's not being challenged. It's not being challenged by the Conservative Party itself. It's not being challenged by the media. And it's also not being challenged by the institutions of state. So the police, for example, they are not prosecuting political parties for corruption. The court system, when was the last time you saw a minister in the dock for corruption? Not since the late 90s, I don't think. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong there. So we have a whole country that are permitting this to proceed, and there's noise about it. And yes, you can read Private Eye to get the details on whatever it is the latest corruption scandal. And yes, there are parliamentary investigations about the PPE contract, for example, and so on. All themselves would be significant scandals. But where are the consequences for those scandals? There aren't any. So unfortunately, that means it's all been normalised. The whole system had normalised it. And by association, the whole system had normalised all the arguments, all the drivers behind Brexit. We're living in a bit of a sort of post-truth environment where the politicians who are defending Brexit themselves are tainted by corruption, deeply tainted. And yet they're putting out a whole variety of statements that justifies that corruption and justifies the absolutely insane things that justify Brexit. And that is not being challenged. It is not being challenged because the whole environment has become permissive, allows them. And some people do believe it. Some people will actually believe those utterly ludicrous statements. And this is because there's a lot of noise around it. There's a lot of mud being thrown around. And one of the perhaps most dangerous phrases that the general electorate might say is, oh yes, politicians are corrupt, but they are all the same. And unfortunately, that's extremely dangerous thinking, because that is part of the process of normalizing it. It creates that permissive culture. And if you create that permissive culture, you can never fight back against it. You have no allies. You have no ability to, to hold those people to account, to put them into jail. And this is the whole problem. The whole system is now geared toward everything around Brexit cannot be criticised. Even though any policy, no matter how good a policy, will always have flaws, will always have things that need to be improved. Yet for some reason that doesn't seem to exist when it comes to Brexit, or not allowed to exist. Unfortunately, the situation keeps on getting worse. It's not just about the politics, and not just about the media, but I'm talking about the institutions of the state. So let's pick on a couple of examples. Liz Truss and the Conservative Party keep boasting about the trade deals, the post-Brexit trade deal that they have implemented. In the past time, and by past time I'm talking at least 2 or 3 decades, those trade deals would never have been allowed to happen. That is because the civil service was neutral, and itself in a way quite conservative, I guess, in terms of how they, not conservative politically, but conservative in the way in how they conducted their business. So they would have insisted that any such trade deals would have been analysed, conducted properly by experienced professionals within the civil service. That did not happen. Instead, they accepted the political agenda that those trade deals must happen as rapidly as possible, regardless of the harm it was caused to the UK economy, and regardless of the fact that no one with any brains whatsoever thinks you should negotiate a trade deal within 1 year. But they did that. And they did that because they were part of that permissive environment. The civil service was no longer neutral. It no longer had the confidence to challenge politicians like Liz Truss to say, this idea of yours is utterly stupid and cannot be allowed to happen. We will modify it and make your policy happen in a way that is constructive and positive to the UK. They did not do that. They don't feel the ability to do that. So again, they become complicit in that corruption. They become part of that process. They cannot moderate it. Worse still, there are quite a few stories that Private Eye will report on, for example, and even The Guardian and others, of senior civil servants who themselves would take money or directorships from companies or other conflicts of interest that they really should not have. And this is one of the key examples of the earlier thing I was saying about corruption. If those at the top are seen as corrupt, then those below them will give up fighting it, essentially, and become part of it, become part of the problem. And we're seeing that in the institutions of the state, whether that be the civil service, whether that be the police failing to prosecute political crime, whether that be the court system not being sometimes reluctant to hold politicians and government to account for what they're doing. And at the moment, it is the judicial system that is fighting the government, whether that be on illegal immigration policies or, such as the Rwanda policy, for example. But even the judicial system, the famously independent judicial system, is under threat from the Conservative Party. And yet that itself does not seem to be triggering a whole host of alarm bells, which, politically speaking, is extremely disturbing. So we're ending up in a scenario where the Brexit is forming its own bubble, its own distortion reality field, and that no individual, no group really feels sufficiently empowered to challenge it, to stand up to it. They're being steamrolled by the weight of the people that supposedly support Brexit. And the problem is what that really results in is that things just keep getting worse. By any objective measure that anyone wishes to use, Brexit has been a disaster. You look at all the economic data, you look at all the political problems, you look at, anything, whether it's the judiciary, the NHS, the police, it is all going wrong. And I know what people will say. They say, well, that's nothing to do with Brexit. And in some ways they would be right. But the problem is because this corrupt ideology that itself is intrinsically linked to Brexit, it means that those institutions cannot challenge and aren't being protected from some truly distorted decision making. And the final example that I'm going to highlight to really personalize this more, because this has all been a bit abstract, but the next bit isn't. Recent reports have highlighted some of the chronically awful stories, really, about sex abuse in Westminster. So it is well known that there's a list of at least 40 MPs, and not all Conservatives, so it'd be wrong of me just to make this Conservative, but there are 40 MPs who are basically considered to be sex pests or sex abusers. And many women MPs or staff who work at Westminster are warned to avoid those individuals. So think about that for a minute. What kind of organisation do you work in? Would your organisation tolerate, even 40 individuals known to be sex abusers working in that organisation, and all they do is tell the women in that organisation, yeah, don't get in the lift with this individual? That is just astonishingly awful. And we've all heard the stories about bullying, whether that be about Dominic Raab or Gavin Williamson. And the point is, this all feeds into the permissive culture. Why are these individuals still there? Why are they allowed to still be MPs? And again, this comes back to because they support Brexit, because they're part of the corrupt system. And the system relies upon their individual support, or the political party relies upon their individual support. If all of those individuals, for sex crime, for bullying, and probably a whole host of other criminal offences that they really should be in trial for, if all of them lost their seats tomorrow, the Conservative Party, not just, and some of the other parties as well, but the Conservative Party would probably come close to losing its majority. That's how bad the scale of the problem is. So that is why none of those individuals will be held to account. Because Brexit is more important, or party politics is more important than right and wrong in a workplace environment. And that itself should tell you the culture at Westminster. And if you have a group of people who operate in that way, then why on earth would you trust them with running anything important, whether that be a government or something as big and as complicated as the Brexit project? Now, I'm conscious that this is quite a long video, even by my standards, I suppose, so I shall seek to wrap this up now and conclude some of the things that we should think about in the context of this conversation. The culture that's around the implementation of Brexit is awful. It's a dreadful culture in Westminster. It's, I suppose, probably an analogy of imagine 60s or 70s Britain, where people were intolerant of people of colour, intolerant of of gays. So being homophobic, being racist, being downright nasty was just normalised. That is Westminster today. Not all people, and it'd be unfair to label all MPs like that. But it is indisputably true that there is a significant vein of that kind of culture running through the Westminster establishment. That culture, that group of people, are in charge of the government. And they have no moral, they've lost their moral compass. They're willing to accept money. They're willing to justify anything that they will do. They will label anybody that disagrees with them as anti-growth or woke. That is just an attack line. That is literally just to discredit people. It's not to discredit the argument, but to try and discredit the people because they cannot argue against the argument. They completely don't have a leg to stand on. And the end result of that is that even if you're in the camp of thinking that the Brexit was a good idea, it's been given to the worst people possible to implement. And whenever you give something big and important to people with very poor attitude, very poor culture, and who are quite frankly corrupt and bent and dishonest and incompetent, then you can hardly be surprised that the results are less than desirable. And so this is the problem that the UK has today, is that not all the UK's problems are due to Brexit, far from it. But there's so many of them are linked to Brexit. More importantly, so many of them are linked to the culture that underpinned Brexit, that refuses to accept challenge, that refuses to even look at economic data and to say, well, you know what, we haven't done this right, let's just change what we're doing. Nothing as big as this can be gotten right first time round. But if you have a culture that refuses to accept that will just live in its own little bubble, no matter the reality, then even the best project is going to fail. It's going to crash and burn disastrously. So as a consequence of this, as well as all the other criticism that we can make of Brexit, we absolutely have to acknowledge that the corruption at the heart of the Conservative Party, at the heart of British politics, because the British political system is geared towards enabling corruption, that corruption is at the heart of Brexit as well. And until a disconnect is made, until Brexit is disconnected from that corruption, until the problem has been identified, you're never going to find any solution. The political system in the UK will not find a solution until it is willing to acknowledge that problem and tackle it. In the meantime, ordinary people in the UK will continue to suffer. The economy will continue to go into decline. The UK will continue to be an international laughingstock. And things will just continue to get worse. So it's important to understand is to have this look at this whole issue of corruption, because it's just not going to fix the problem if we don't. And it feels extremely frustrating that this conversation cannot be had, that people cannot clearly say that the job needs to be given to people not tainted by their corruption, whether that's in or outside of the Conservative Party. And until any of that happens, things are just going to continue to get worse, I think. So perhaps not a particularly cheery note to end it, but there's only 2 years left, what can I say? And I suppose we can look upon it as Brexit having been a very interesting, if somewhat flawed experiment, and that perhaps for those who want it reversed as quickly as possible, that making that association with corruption will help in that particular aim. So we shall see if the political music changes to that. But what has to be acknowledged is that those at the heart of this project, those fully embedded within all the corruption, not just Conservative, but predominantly Conservatives, embedded with the corruption, embedded with Brexit, the stakes for them are now exceedingly high. If Brexit fails, then it starts to throw up all the other problems, like their corruption. And when all that comes out to light, or PPE contracts, maybe even whatever other things, there's a whole host of scandals lurking within there. And when all of that comes out, those people, I would hope, although I'm not too optimistic about it, but I would hope that they are at serious risk of going to trial and then going to prison. So as a consequence of this, Brexit must be defended at all costs, because Brexit itself defends the corruption. Knock down Brexit, and perhaps you start to knock down corruption. We can only hope. So I hope you found this video interesting. Sorry it was a bit lengthy and perhaps a little bit in-depth, but I hope that was insightful and interesting to people, and I look forward to seeing what people's comments are on it.